All right, guys. So one thing that we discussed when we very first got an introduction to the Byzantine Empire was we kind of compared and contrasted the differences between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church that emerged. I wanted to do that section first because, that was a major splitting point in world history where we had a little bit of the influence of the Catholic Church removed, and we needed to get in on that. But there's more to this time period than just the emergence of a secondary option for Christians. This I wanted to spend a little bit more time on, so that's why I chose to do the focus on the religion in the first part, where we had the very end of last week to do that. And this week we are going to be looking more at the actual history of the Byzantine Empire. Now, what I've done is on the main page for Schoology, I have added 2 links here. Well, I want to deal with the first one first, obviously. And then the second one is an additional one that I think you will find interesting. It's pretty informative. But it is an extra. So it is not necessary, but I think that some of you will enjoy that. So I'm going to show it all to you today. But first, let's look at the Byzantine Empire. Now, first and foremost, if you've been in class, I've said it before, I said it again. When you're studying the history of Rome and people say the fall of the Roman Empire, the answer is which time? Because the Roman Empire has came and went. And as many times as it has fallen, it has risen again. Sometimes later on, we refer to it by a different name. Now, eventually, when we studied ancient Rome, you had the fall of the Roman Empire, which sometimes is called the Western Roman Empire, was around... I remember, we're not talking exact dates here, but around 300 CE. After that point, the emperor at the time, Emperor Constantine I, he basically picked up the capital for the Roman Empire and placed it in a city called Byzantium. Now, Byzantium is in modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. And I'll get to that on a map in just a second so you can see some comparisons. But they then renamed Byzantium New Rome. Well, eventually, New Rome, if I remember right, it changed names one more time, but we don't really focus there. But it changed names again to Constantinople. Constantinople was named after Constantine I. This was, the city of Constantine. And this is where we have the recognition of the beginning of what we call the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was, at the time that it existed, was not seen as the Byzantine Empire. And I know that sounds strange, but hang with me for just a second. The people at that time saw themselves as Romans. They did not see themselves as separate. They picked up and they moved. They saw themselves as Romans. So later on in history, we had the Renaissance. Well, they wanted a definitive point in time to say, this is the Roman history that we are idolizing. This is what we are modeling ourselves after. This is, the great thinkers that there was. And when the capital moved to Byzantium or Constantinople, the Renaissance thinkers did not want to acknowledge that part of Roman history. So it wasn't until then that the idea of the Byzantine Empire existed. At the time, they just thought of themselves as Romans. The Byzantine Empire was something that came about later on in time, closer into the 1500s, where it was given that name. So that's just a little side thing, but will come back up and, will be something that you will need later on. Now, when Constantine took charge, Christianity became the state religion. This was a break from having pagan religions as the state religions, and what we had was a development of what we just studied, the Eastern Orthodox Church. We don't have to fully go into that. We've already covered that. You can look at that in the other assignments, and if you have been in class, we had some sidebar conversations where we discussed that. But the takeaway is there was a hard line drawn in the way things were thought about, the way things were approached, the way things were dealt with, even so much as to later on in history, they wanted a different name for this time period. So, Constantinople, the city, there's not a uncertainty about when it was founded, but there is not an argument, but a disagreement about what date we can put on the beginning of the Byzantine Empire. Some people use the founding of Constantinople. Some use the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Some use the failure of Justinian I. He was trying to bring the two together in the mid-500s. But regardless, the end of the Byzantine Empire was marked by the Ottoman Empire conquering Constantinople in 1453. In May 29th, 1453. That date is not disputed. That is pretty much the recognized day of we are acknowledging that after this point, it was no longer Roman. So we have the 2 days. So let's take a quick look at Constantinople. Like I said early, the original name for the city was Byzantium, and it lies in current day Istanbul, Turkey. Now, I loaded up 2 maps for you here. This one is zoomed in, and it is from the PDF here. You can click this, and it will give you a much clearer view. But this is during the Byzantine, what we recognize as the Byzantine Empire. This is the city of Constantinople. Now, this is a combination of a thematic map. It's an overlay. It does have some topographic features where you can see the peaks and valleys of the mountain regions. But you will notice that right here, and I'm trying to zoom this in so it's a little bit clearer for you, and I can get it out from where my head should be in this lower right hand corner. All right, I think I have it up high enough now. If you look right in here, you see some names of things that we will discuss. So you have majorly the Hagia Sophia right here. We will look at this in just a second, and we'll go into a little more detail there. That is a big one to pay attention to. The Gate of St. Emilianus, we aren't going to get there so much. It'll pop up. But the harbor of Theodosius, the Gate of the Lion, different things like this, the Gate of St. Barbara, things are going to show up. And what these were ways into the city. Constantinople was a fairly well fortified city. It had direct access to the water, so it had to be. This was a major hub and a major trading point. If you look down here, there is some, well, I say right here. It's covered up with my face. Hold on. Let me pop it up so it might show up. There we go. This should be a little bit clearer for you. the key at the bottom of the map. This is going to mark churches and monasteries. The modern Turkish names are in italics. So some of these places that we're going to study, they are not currently called these things, but what they are currently called, if you were to look them up, is going to be in italics under them. You have cisterns, the different roads, you have a shoreline, and then city quarters, the foreign quarters, the walls, but the year of enclosure with walls being 1400. All of these things is down here in the key. Now, how does this compare to modern day? I want to show you so we know where we're talking about. All right. Europe, Spain, Italy, where we were in Rome, we came down, went across the Mediterranean, and up. Now, Turkey, right here. Put it in relation to places that you know of, you've heard of. We have Egypt to the south. We have Israel to the south, Saudi Arabia to the southeast. We are, if we're talking about Turkey, we are west of Iran and Afghanistan, and we are below the Black Sea. You know, when we studied ancient Greece, we talked about all the islands that were over here in the Aegean Sea. Come up through the Aegean Sea, through here, and right here on the very, 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 very tipping point of Turkey is Istanbul. Now, there we go. I have it on satellite view. Now you can see comparatively what we are talking about. This is where we are looking on the map in modern day. So let's look at a comparison. We have the Hagia Sophia. We're going to zoom in just a little bit to right here. As you can see, this doesn't say Hagia Sophia, but if you look around, Hagia Sophia Fountain. Some things are still called it, and we can find them that way. But that's what this is. So, all right. But we'll come back to what the Hagia Sophia was and is today. It is a highlight of studying the Byzantine Empire, I guess you could say. But we're going to go back over here to the main PDF. We're going to take a look at the Byzantine emperors. Now, like I said, at the time, they considered themselves to be Roman, not necessarily Byzantine. But there was a hierarchy inside of the empire. Typically, they're just like any other empire or civilization. There's going to be things they take from others, and there's going to be things that they do on their own. One of the more interesting things to me is that on the Byzantine coins, you would have the emperor, but it would also show who the emperor had chose as their successor. This would sometimes be the oldest son, but because there were no set rules, they could declare who they were choosing to be their successor. And if you were to put it on the coins, it would get people used to the idea that this person is going to be in charge next. And it was a way to kind of ensure a continuity, and that the ideas and the ideals weren't lost as the empire was handed down from hand to hand. The emperors, you chose your successor, but the emperors were thought that they were chosen by God. So if they were chosen by God, then they could also have the right to choose who their successor was, and then it would be correct because they were chosen by God. So then they wouldn't be wrong if they chose the next emperor. Like there was a infallacy to what they would say. So you would think, that might be a little unstable, but it lasted for 12 centuries. So they were doing something that worked. Now, the government, aside from the emperor, they largely based the style of their government on what they had in previous Rome. But there were some differences. They kind of took the skeleton and then put their own, meat on those bones. So you had the idea of the Senate. You had the idea of the emperor. But, like, for example, in Rome, there was a certain class of people that were senators. In Constantinople, the idea of senators was that they came through the ranks by military service, and then they would become senators. So it was you didn't have to end up where you started. You could change your rank in life, your social class. Now, were there exceptions to that? Were there people that the idea was, we are going to be born into wealth and we're going to stay in wealth. We're going to have that influence. We're going to be landowners. We're going to have status in society, and that is never going to change? Yes, 100% yes, that has always been, and that never will not be. But there was the idea that you could come up through those classes. I want you to look through this part right here. This gets into a little bit more detail regarding the eunuchs, the group of elite senators, essentially the magistrate of the area who made sure they were over the administration of the palace, those that were there to protect the palace. You had a simple form of ambassadors that they dealt with foreign affairs. So I want you to read in here on the section regarding the government. Now, Justinian Code, we'll get to the Justinian Code in a future lesson. But, simple version, the Justinian Code was a collection of Roman laws that had been put together over the centuries that it has existed. This code lasted and was the ruling law for almost 1,000 years. There was a constant effort to clarify what was in the law so that people could understand it, that it wasn't, today you're not going to understand law and law code really unless you're a lawyer, because it's so convoluted and muddy. But at this time, the idea was we want to make it as clear as we can so that everybody understands what is expected of them, the consequences, and so on and so forth. But like I said, we'll get to the Justinian Code in a future lesson, probably later this week. But this was the code that ruled Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Now, Byzantine society, I want you personally to look through this part. This will pop up later. This is addressing the classes that existed, what they would do. There's a little mention of somehow art would affect the architecture and things like that, and then it skips down. We'll touch that again. But I know everybody, when you read this, you're going to focus in on two things. This right here at the very end. The least respected professions were, as elsewhere, prostitutes and actresses. And you're going to say, why? So I want to explain this. And this is simply put, and this carries out even into the British Empire. Actors and actresses, if you were an actor, it was considered that you lied for a living. You made your money off of lying. And if the official state religion is Christianity, you are not supposed to lie. So it was seen as you are making your money by sinning. And sins were seen as equal. So prostitution and acting, they weren't seen as equals, but they were equally looked down upon in the society. That's why those two are there. Like I said, that carries into the British Empire all the way up through, the time of Shakespeare. It is still looked down upon. It is only in more recent times, toward the early to middle 1800s, that idea actually faded. Now, territories of the Byzantine Empire. Once again, I want you to look into this because at one point, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, all of these areas were under the control of the Byzantine Empire. They all abide by the same rules as the Byzantine Empire because they all used Constantinople as their capital. You did have major cities that were part of this. You had Alexandria, you had Jerusalem, you had Carthage. You still had Rome, but they were ruled from Constantinople. Now, later on, and I'm skipping past the church because we've talked about that. Let's see, architecture. No. Okay. So I'm just going to talk for a second. Later on, we have the fall of the Byzantine Empire. This is where the Ottoman Empire comes in is it 1453? I'm going to scroll to the top just to double check my numbers real quick. 1453, yes. When the Ottoman Empire lay siege upon Constantinople and takes it over, you gain more of a Islamic influence in the area. You have the change of the Hagia Sophia from a Christian church to a mosque, and this stayed the same except for a very small period of time, if I remember right, where it was occupied by Britain, and you had a small influence of priests and monks that were there, and then they were ran out. I think that only occurred for just under 50 years, maybe like 43 years. Don't quote me on that number. That's me going off the top of my head. But this conquest showed that this was an important area. Throughout history, only the important areas have been conquered. And that sounds weird for a second, but no one fights over an area that they don't consider important. No one fights over an area that is useless if they can't get something from it. So Constantinople was seen as a center. It was a trading center. It was a place of huge influence. And because it was the capital of an entire empire that, went through the Mediterranean and, the Aegean, then if you could take over the capital, then you could have influence over those areas as well. So that made Constantinople a very desirable territory to conquer and to take over. Now, a little bit later, we'll get into the final siege of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire. Not at this very moment, but I mentioned earlier about the Hagia Sophia. It changed from a Christian church to a mosque, and then back to a Christian, then back to a mosque. I have included a link in Schoology. It's right here. And this is going to let you see what the Hagia Sophia looks like on the inside. Now, back over here on the main link, I'm skipping over. Like I said, we've already talked about the founding of the Eastern Orthodox Church. This gives you much, much, much more detail. That's why I have this on here. But skip down right here to Byzantine art. We had a change in the way artists started approaching the way, not just the way they painted things. That sounds weird. But the way they saw things. There was a change in the concepts of what is art. And before the 13th century, artists weren't exactly respected. They weren't disrespected, but it wasn't like because you were a good artist, you had a high role in society. That is a concept that came later in time. Before the 13th, you were just an artist. You were another work person. You were a workman. You had a trade. You did it, and that was it. After that, then it became a social status thing. That if you were a great artist, you had an elevated class. You were still seen as a tradesman, but you were kind of above and a little bit more respected. There was something extra to what you did, not just anybody could train to do it. And like I said, it's not that it's hard to understand, but sometimes it's hard to comprehend because we live in a completely different society. So they started changing the way they would do art. We went to an idea of mosaics more than just simple paintings. And mosaics are the ones where we have small pieces of broken glass or broken pottery or broken tile, and we reassemble them in a way to create a larger picture. Think of it as each individual piece is like a pixel in a picture, and then they would slowly arrange each pixel to match the larger picture. But a true mosaic, which is what we see in the Hagia Sophia, the only word for this is grand. Think of it this way. If you started on one side of the Hagia Sophia, now most of the time mosaics were on the ground. Hagia Sophia, they started putting them in front of them on the walls. But there would be certain places you were supposed to stand to see these mosaics. So if you were standing in one spot, the artist who put the mosaics on the wall, some of these were dull pieces of pottery or glass, and some were polished, highly polished. And some were even put on a gold leaf background, which would also, be polished. But they would tilt the individual pieces of the glass and the pottery so that it would reflect light at a certain angle back to the person who was viewing it. So as the person maybe swayed, changed the direction their head was pointing, it would glitter and it would glisten and it would literally shine as the people were looking at it. And you could use that to highlight certain things in the mosaics. This is where the artistry took over. And we'll look in just a second because we're fixing to talk about architecture. Inside the Hagia Sophia, there is a dome. And at the very bottom of this dome, it is nothing but a row of windows. And it is 360. So light, unless the light was almost about to set when the sun was going down or right when it came up, then you had a constant light source in the middle. And it would change and it would reflect. And these mosaics, they were true art, but they also told a story. In order, it would have examples of different emperors. It would have the story of Constantinople from the beginning till they stopped. There's a small break in between for, I think, 50-something years where we really don't know much about what happened in that time period at all. And there's no updates to the mosaics. There's no updates to the timeline. But other than that, we have a fairly consistent and constant evolution of the timeline just inside of this one building through the art. Okay, I'm going to skip down. I can get sidetracked on that all day long. The dome inside the Hagia Sophia. Now, this is a picture of the inside, and you can barely see right across top right here part of the windows that go on the underside of that dome. But you had they brought the architecture of Rome with them, is the best way to say it. The arches, had the aqueducts come through, the idea of amphitheaters, public baths. they brought this. But when they brought it, they brought the architecture, not just we use these arches for this purpose or we use these domes for this purpose. They brought them and then gave them new applications. So it was more than just the buildings themselves. They brought the actual engineering from the architecture and then used it and applied it to new buildings. They started using some new materials. Things that were reserved in the Roman Empire, they used a little more freely in the Byzantine Empire. So in this paragraph that's up on the screen right now, your favored building materials were bricks and mortar with concrete. That's always been there. We use that today. But you had marble, which Romans threw marble everywhere. They still used marble, but not as much. This was more for a decorative purpose. Details over a door or a window or for a column, something that was meant to grab attention, would be made out of marble. Before there was marble everywhere. The inside, they would cover the beams with plaster and stucco, but then on top of that, they would paint directly on the wall, or they would do a mosaic on the wall or on the floor. Now, this brings up Hagia Sophia. It gives you the dimensions, but the dome ceiling 55 meters above the floor. That's tall. That's more than a normal dome. Now, there was even an idea and I'll show you the outside of it in a second, I think. If I don't, you'll see it in another video that I'm going to post. But there was a point on the top of the dome with a small spire. And it was so high, and with the windows at the bottom, they said that the dome looked like it was suspended from heaven. So this was meant to be a very grand structure. It was to inspire. It was to make you feel connected to heaven. And it worked. Now, until the 16th century, it was the largest church in the world and is one of the most decorated, with Christian churches in the Byzantine Empire. This is where their contributions to architecture continues even today. The idea of domes in churches, this came from the Byzantine Empire. The idea of how to support them, this came from the architecture of the Byzantine Empire. Half domes, the positioning of baptistries, the layout of early mausoleums meant for certain people. All of these things were from the Byzantine Empire. And this went on to influence not only architecture in the empire, architecture throughout the world, religious, specifically Christian architecture, but very specifically the Orthodox Christian architecture. They still base most built Eastern Orthodox churches using the aspects of this architecture today as a form of tradition, that you are sticking to the old ways of the way things were. But I'm going to backtrack one more time. The Hagia Sophia. All right. What I have included is a place that does a 360 virtual tour, so you can kind of see what it looks like. Now, it's just on the side of a street. So you have the outside here. You can see this tall spire right here, and you can't really see the dome from this point, but we're going to go down a little bit, and you click on each of these pictures, and it takes you to a different point inside. So we're in a hallway, but look up. You see this on the ceiling. You see all these individual archways. You see and I forget the name, it's actually mentioned in the other text, but these crossing arches that are there for support over these arches. You see the decorative floors. You see the decorative walls, the doors. This is a inspiring building, and it was then as well. Now, inside of the main. Now, this one's a little bit distorted, but that is because this is so large. This is the dome. You see all of these little windows. Now, this one has some support structure where they're doing some work, repairing some stuff and restoring things. And it is, it's more of a museum now, but it is a mosque. It's recognized as a mosque. So you do see your different placards on the wall through here. But as you go through this, just notice the different elements of the architecture that are here. Click on this one right here. No, this is the one that was up under the chandeliers. You couldn't see that well. Where was it? I think it was this one. Yes. This was as close as I could get to directly under the dome. But just look, okay, here's the size of a normal person to this wall right here. So let's say this guy right here is around 6 foot tall. That means that this is probably a 7.5 or 8 foot wall here. So carry that all the way up. Like we said, the tippy top point of this dome right here is 55 meters above the floor. This is huge. And then you look at all the windows. This was a massive amount of light. This was a huge undertaking of both engineering, artistry, architecture. This is something that has stood the ages. So once again, this is just something that I thought was cool. It gives you an idea of what we're talking about. You can actually see it because it still exists. I will post later, once we go further. There's not a assignment to go along with this. This is a lesson. This is something that we are going to stack on when we do the Justinian Code and have our assignment that builds on top of that. And this will work for us to finally get to the end of this unit. So if you have any questions about this, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, like I said, I'll briefly touch on the siege of Constantinople after this as well. But if you have any specific questions about anything that's included in this, send me a message. I will be glad to talk in detail with any questions that you have that are directly related to this, that even aren't related to this. If they are history related and this just made you think of something, send me a message. If you are remote, make sure that you are staying on track with stuff as it is posted. Pay attention that if it has a due date, it is an assignment. Pay attention to posted lock dates. Make sure that you're checking the main page, not just the grade book, and clicking the individual assignment names. You don't want to miss, like for example, if you're doing that, you may not see this post. So make sure you're going about things the right way, communicating with me, and hopefully this semester is going to go a lot cleaner than last semester. Again, any questions, send me a message on Schoology, send me an email. And if not, I will see you soon on my next video.